Bonjour, hi, and welcome to my apartment atelier. This month, I decided I wanted to add another item to my history-bounding wardrobe, and with warmer weather well established here in Montreal, it was the perfect time to do a summer dress. If you're familiar with the costume community, you've probably already seen other creators adapting distinct historical dresses into slightly more modern summer frocks, and it's something I've been wanting to do for myself for a while now. I decided to go with the Regency era for my historical to modern summer dress. I actually really love the high-waisted silhouette with flowing skirts that was popular at the time. I also like how I can probably get away with not making any special undergarments for this, which is great because I currently do not have time for that. The pattern I'm using is Black Snail Patterns number 0119, which is a pattern for a dress and sleeveless spencer in the style of 1805 to 1810. I'll be using stash fabric for this project, which I'm very excited about because all of my fabric crates are quite full right now, and it's time to make some room for more make some more clothes. So let's leave Project Me to finish getting that PDF pattern trimmed and taped, and let's see how this goes. My purple dinosaur silk is kind of in rough shape after an unfortunate encounter with my cat in a glass of soda. I fixed that with the wash to get the fabric cleaned and uniformly messed up before pressing. The iron was set very low, but because the fabric was still damp, the iron steamed all those creases flat, and while it was no longer flawless, at least it was flat again, and I was able to cut my pattern pieces with little drama. I decided to construct the spencer almost entirely by hand. Apart from machine stitching the seams of the lining pieces, everything else was done by hand using my favorite tiny needle and some silk thread from my stash. bottom edge of the Spencer lining was attached to the bottom of the fashion fabric using a pointe à rabat sur la main, which to me at least seems similar to a felling stitch, and has stitching visible on the right side. You'll see later that I ended up just using a slip stitch to do the other edges, as it was a little faster for me and invisible from the outside. In this pattern, the raw edges of the back piece and the front pieces are left flat, while the corresponding edges of the axe-shaped pieces in the middle are turned over and carefully sewn from the outside with a spaced backstitch or a prick stitch. Regardless of the stitch used to join them though, all the curved seams got some little V-shaped clips in the allowances to help them turn in nicely. I also had some runs in one of the shoulder seams that were showing by the end of construction, due both to fraying and my cutting being slightly off on that piece. So here I'm just using a bit of cabbage to cover both shoulder seams and using a spaced backstitch to secure the pieces. While Project Me is tracing out and prepping pattern pieces for the dress on this very cute, very blue-printed cotton, I wanted to take a short detour from just fun sewing content in pretty fabric to talk a bit about the historical context of garments like this dress. For a lot of people, Georgian Britain, 1740 to 1837, and particularly the period of the Regency, 1811 to 1820, is defined by works of fiction that we've read as well as their corresponding film adaptations. Because the most popular representations of the period are works of literature and film that focus on specific narratives of white, middle, and upper-class British and European folk, the period, like many other eras of history, is highly romanticized. And as tends to happen when something is highly romanticized, many of us gloss over the unsavory bits at best and are completely oblivious to them at worst. Given recent events in the broader historical costuming community, wherein the problematic nature of costuming without context was revealed through questionable behavior demonstrated by some of the community's more prolific members, I want to do what I can to give context to my historical-inspired projects. That way I, and any of my viewers who are so inclined, can work towards dispelling some of our overly romantic notions about the past. Some of the defining historical events of Georgian and Regency Britain are major wars between 1776 and 1815, namely the American and French Revolutions, followed by the Napoleonic Wars. In addition to the well-known political impact these wars had on the world, we also need to be mindful that they added to the laundry list of social and economic problems that plagued the colonial world. Wars don't just have an impact on political power and on maps. The very fact that maps can and do change depending on the outcome of battles and wars means that the people living in those geographical areas are subjected to great upheaval and exploitation, both from political power shifts in faraway capitals and armies on the ground trying to assert dominance and control over the local populations. However, this is not a uniquely British Georgian or British Regency situation. This is not unique to one nation, one era, or one war. The entire operation of European conquest and colonization not only made it possible for these things to happen, but also contributed to perpetuating them long after initial contact happened. Everywhere colonization happened, the people who were there before colonizers suffered greatly when they arrived. Everyone should already be aware that the Euro-American slave trade that ravaged the people of Africa was well established by this point in time, and that enslaved black people were mercilessly degraded and exploited both in Europe and in the Americas in every possible way. We should also all be aware that racism as a result of the slave trade is still very much a reality for black people. If, for some reason, you're still under the impression that racism no longer exists in the world, let alone in the costuming community, I would highly recommend checking out some of the content I've listed in the description box below to help you educate yourself on these issues. But what does this all mean for fashion? Fashion is just pretty clothes and fancy accessories, isn't it? Well, not really. All those beautiful gowns that you see in portraits and fashion plates also have their own problematic history, including the style of the one I'm making now. That's because the fabrics that define the highest pinnacle of British and European fashionable elegance were all made with heavy reliance on the exploitation of marginalized people, both in faraway colonies and at home. I have more thoughts on this, but I'll let you ruminate while we turn our attention back to the dress. I'm going rogue on the pattern right now, having opted not just for flatlining the bodice lining layers to the fashion fabric, but also for using a serger to finish all my seams. Honestly, I could have done more handwork on these interior seams, but at this point in time, having a finished garment was higher on my list of priorities than having a historically stitched garment. Machines do not hinder my joy or diminish my overall satisfaction in my work. In fact, they make the process very enjoyable for me, and I'm really lucky to have 3 machines that trundle splendidly alongside me in my sewing adventures. I did choose to go with hand sewing for the visible stitching on the dress, namely the spaced back stitch that I used to finish the top edge of the back pieces, and later you'll see I did the same spaced back stitch on the waistband. Wherever I have visible stitching on the outside of the dress, I'm using matching blue silk thread. The edge finishing on the back seam also encases 2 drawstrings that help cinch the back closed, and another encased drawstring across the front panel of the bodice gathers the fabric down in a wonderfully floofy manner over the bust. While sewing the bodice seams, I'm making sure to catch the ends of all my drawstrings in my stitching to anchor them. My antique machine makes minuscule stitches that keep the seams strong. I then pressed all my seams, of course, and even for my shortened length, I still had to flip the skirt around to evenly press the entire length of my skirt seams on my tiny tabletop ironing board. The entire length of the bodice then gets sandwiched between the fashion and lining fabric of the waistband and stitched down. Those gathers are then coaxed and stroked into place to my own historically adequate standards. Time for sleeves. These get a little bit of gathering at the top of the shoulder and an inverted box pleat at the elbow. After pressing the cuffs accordingly, I first pin the sleeves before securing them in place with a basting stitch. I'm also now taking the time to finish the top edges of the bodice by turning in the edges and whip stitching them down only to the lining so that it doesn't show on the outside. I chose to use my more modern machine to attach the sleeves because it has a removable section that makes stitching sleeves a little less fiddly. After pinning the front of the skirt to the waistband and securing the wide box pleat at center front, the top edge of the back skirt also gets some gathering threads. It's kind of hard to tell what I'm doing here because somebody didn't get decent close-up footage of this step. Basically, I'm attaching the skirt using the stitching line where the bodice connects to the waistband as a guide. I'm stitching the skirt down between the seam where the bodice meets the waistband and the other edges of the various pieces involved. I had already serged around the bottom of the waistband lining, so I just left it free and pressed it down over all those exposed edges inside. I'm now spending the time I saved by not sewing the waistband lining on hand stitching the outside of the waistband down using more spaced back stitches. A rolled hem foot on my modern machine gets the hem finished nicely, and with a little bit of hand stitching to get my custom tag in place, it's finally done. Of all the garments I've made since starting this channel, this is probably my favorite so far. It was quite the adventure, not just in terms of just making the dress itself, but also in the sense that I was making it at a time when my community of costumers, cosplayers, and historybounders encouraged me to dive deeper into the actual historical context of clothes. Going forward, I'm always going to challenge myself to continue thinking critically about the historical aspect of historical costuming and historybounding. This project has definitely brought forward in my mind the reality that the materials I use in my projects don't just come out of nowhere, and that's a fact that goes all the way back to when humans first started making clothes. Garments like this dress may have been made by trained craftspeople who could make a living off this trade, and in the end purchased and worn by people of privilege and of means. But before all of that could happen, the countless unnamed men, women, and children of marginalized groups had to raise, harvest, and process the various fibers under deplorable conditions, and often also had to witness the destabilization and appropriation of their own cultures while working to provide colonizers with these desirable materials. And sadly, it's still happening to their descendants today. So, the next time you sit down to create a historical or historical-inspired piece of clothing, or honestly, even the next time you just sit down to read or watch something set in historical eras, think a little more critically of what it is you're making and admiring. Put fashion in its historical context to broaden your knowledge and increase your understanding of why historical clothes actually do speak volumes about world history, as well as why some historical costumers say almost nothing about it and why this needs to be changed. I do hope you enjoyed your visit today. À la prochaine.